Good evening, Brisbane. Man, this is quite a theater. There's a lot of you folks out there. Well, we're very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to bring Dr. Jordan Peterson right on stage right away, and I'm sure he'll be here and fill your minds with all kinds of new and exciting conundrums. I'm just going to tell you a very quick story, and then I'll bring him out. So before we came to Australia, we were in California, and Dr. Peterson decided he was going to go to Orlando for 3 days and then fly to Australia, and I thought that seemed like going 3 hours in the wrong direction first. Didn't sound like a good idea. So I decided to go and see his sister in Palo Alto, California. But she had other plans. She wanted to go to Honolulu and visit her daughter who goes to university there. And I thought, Hawaii, that's even closer to New Zealand. Let's go there. So I said I'd go. So once we decided to go, she told me, my daughter's there and she wants us to go swimming with sharks. And I thought, okay. So I'd seen her daughter on Instagram swimming with sharks, and I mean, it looked pretty cool, so I said yes, and Dr. Peterson said no. But I said yes, and off we went. So the day we decided to go, it was windy. It was windy, and we were going to go 3.5 miles offshore. So we got in a boat. There were 4 of us going to go in the water, along with a marine biologist and a captain and a photographer. And so off we set, and it was very bumpy and wavy, and the sea was black. We got out 3.5 miles away, and the marine biologist sat down with us, and she said, okay, this is what we're going to do. So I'm going to get in the water first, and I'm going to check out to see what kind of mood the sharks are in. And then she laughed. She said, what happens usually is the fishermen come out to this area and they dump the remnants of their fishing expedition out there. And so the sharks know that if they hear the rev of an engine, they're going to get fed. And so that's how we bring the sharks to the boat. So we got there and they revved the boat, and we started seeing shadows in the water and fins following us, and sure enough, there were sharks all around, Galapagos sharks. They grow to be about 11 feet long. And we were told, you want to swim with the school. If you swim against the school, then they think that you're attacking and they'll attack you, so don't do that. And you want to look at the shark. You don't want to hide from the shark, because the shark's trying to figure out, are you food or are you a predator? So we got there, and the marine biologist got in the water, and then I got in the water. And it was warm, it was pretty nice, and we all got in the water, and we looked down, and there they were. The water was blue, reflected from the sky, and you could see these gray sharks with green moss on their backs, it looked like, and they were maybe about 10 feet below us. And there were about 7 or 8 of them swimming around. And now and then they would come up a little closer, and the marine biologist would kind of go down and wave a bit and look at them, and they'd swim away. But at one point, one came fairly close to me, and I looked at his cold, beady eye, and he went by, and he never had anything to do with me. So I wasn't scared, you know, I wasn't scared the whole time, actually. I felt like I was prepared, and I knew that if I did what she asked me to do, it would be okay. When we got out of the boat, I got seasick because it was so bumpy. And of course, everybody else was still in the water, so all the sharks came to the surface. So I guess they do get fed when we come out. I didn't realize that, but they do get fed. But on the way back, it was very quiet, and everybody was kind of introspective. And we were sitting there, and I was thinking, you know, I feel like I accomplished something. You know, I feel confident. I feel confident. I feel like this is something that I could do again, you know, so it gave me confidence to do something more. And I realized that we have to face adversity, you know, we have to, even in a situation like this, you can learn from a situation like this that it's best to face what it is that you're afraid of, that turning away from it will not create confidence, and it won't make you feel like doing it again or something maybe more scary the next time. So that's what I learned on that trip, and I just wanted to share that with you. Thanks very much. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome and help you welcome Dr. Peterson on stage.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a lot of people. I think this is maybe the biggest audience that I've talked with. It's close. So thank you for that. So I'm going to talk tonight. Appreciate that, by the way. And you can pick up your check after the show. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Rule 2 from my Beyond Order book. I think I'll tell you before that, though, that I'm writing a new book. It'll be out next year. At least that's the contractual obligation. I'm hoping I can have it done by the end of April. That's the plan next year. I've got this cool opportunity in Austria. I went to Vienna in the spring, and I was taken to this ancient monastery, Heiligenkreuz. It's about 70 miles outside of Vienna. It's a ridiculously beautiful place. It's 800 years old, and the monks have been trying to make it beautiful for 800 years, and they've definitely succeeded. And the monks there also put out an album, as monks do, of Gregorian chants, and it became a worldwide bestseller, which is odd in two ways, right? So anyways, I was there with Tammy and the people who were touring me around Austria, and I thought, this would be a really good place to go and spend a couple of weeks to finish my book. And so I talked to the people who ran the monastery, and they said that would be just fine. I could come there for 3 weeks. So I'm going to go to a monastery outside of Vienna and finish off this book. And I'm pretty excited about it. It's called We Who Wrestle with God. And I took that title, which I'm very happy about the title, by the way. I took that title from the meaning of the word Israel. So when I was back in 2017, I did a series of lectures on Genesis. And there's a story in Genesis, in the biblical book of Genesis, of Jacob wrestling with an angel or wrestling with God. The story is ambiguous. And he wrestles through the night with the angel or with God, and his hip is damaged as a consequence, but he is victorious, which is strange, to say the least, because you wouldn't think that if you were wrestling with an angel or with God that you would be victorious. And the angel or God announces in the morning that he now has a new name, and his name is Israel, and that's where the word that we're familiar with comes from. That's the story it's derived from. And Israel, so those are the chosen people, the people of Israel, are those who wrestle with God. And I thought, well, that's so interesting. It's so interesting. Why? Well, because we all do that. And if you're tilted in the atheistic direction, you might say, well, that's preposterous. And I would say, no, it's actually more true of you if you're an avowed atheist even than anyone else, because you're wrestling so hard that it's become a cornerstone of your identity. You might be antithetical, let's assume, to the religious enterprise, but you're still so obsessed with issues of morality, let's say, and about the stories that surround morality and about the ethics that should orient us, that's become a cardinal part of your life. So follow God or oppose God, you're pretty much stuck with the wrestling. And the notion that the chosen people of God are those who wrestle with God is such an interesting idea, because the story doesn't make the case that it's the believers who are chosen. It makes the case that those who struggle are those who are chosen. And it makes the case, too, that in that struggle can be intense enough to cause damage. And maybe if you walk away from a wrestling match with God and the only thing that's damaged is your hip, you've had a pretty good bout. You might say that. And also, it's such a strange idea that the person who does that wrestling, let's say in good faith, could emerge victorious. That's about as optimistic an idea as you could possibly promote. And so, I was very struck by that. Struck by the idea that to be chosen properly by God is to wrestle with that which is highest. That's right, not to believe it, but to wrestle with it, right? To be obsessed with it in some sense, to allow it to grip you, the question of what should be uppermost. And you might say, well, nothing should be uppermost, and well, there's a problem with that, because then what the hell are you doing? Or are you fragmented in 50 different directions? If nothing is uppermost, does that just mean confusion and chaos reigns? If you're not psychologically integrated around a single point, let's say, are you not just confused and chaotic and also maybe hopeless? And if your society isn't oriented towards a single destination, let's say, isn't motivated by a shared vision, then isn't your society confused and fragmented and hopeless? And doesn't that imply that there's something like a unity of purpose? Because the alternative would be disunity of purpose, right? Or absence of purpose. None of those seem to be particularly positive. And wouldn't it be something if that purpose was found in the act of the wrestling? Not in a totalitarian belief, or not in a belief that requires the abdication of reason, and not in the blind following of ideology, and not in a hopeless and corrosively bitter cynicism, but in the act of contending itself. And I think that's such an optimistic idea. And so, part of those ideas, some of those ideas, the initial elements of those ideas were making themselves manifest to me when I wrote Beyond Order. And I wrote a rule, which I'm going to talk about tonight. Imagine, it's rule 2, imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. Now, I wrote these rules very carefully. They're obvious in some sense, and I think that's because they're in plain language. But the words are chosen very carefully. And so let me walk through why the rule is phrased the way it is. And I think it's worth inquiring. I think that's worth an inquiry. And why would I say that? Well, the first popular book I published, 12 Rules, I think has sold 7 million copies. It's a lot of books, far more books than I would have ever expected to sell, but it's also generated, it's part of a body of ideas that have generated hundreds of millions of views on YouTube, say, and listens on podcasts, and maybe more than that. It might be over 1 billion. It's a lot. And so there's a reason for that, and I'm not saying that I know the reason, but I am saying that the fact of that popularity is a fact, and it's a fact whose existence is worthy of consideration. And maybe it's partly because the rules capture the public imagination. There's a reason for that. And maybe they capture the public imagination because they're formulated in a compelling manner. So what's the rule here? Imagine. What does that mean? Well, there's a gospel injunction from the Sermon on the Mount. It's a strange injunction. Knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. I hope I got those in the right order. But what does that mean? Well, I actually think it's a description of the initial stages of thought. So, thought's very mysterious. If you think, you can come to a realization, which is an interesting word. Something will make itself real within you, a realization. If you think about something, you can come to a realization that you didn't have before, right? So something new can make itself manifest within you. Now, you could take credit for that, and that's fine, because you might say, well, I thought that up. But that's a pretty shallow theory, I think, because is it you that thought that up? Exactly? The words you use aren't your words, they're words that have been given to you. You might creatively recombine them into novel phrases and sentences, but the very words that you use to structure your thought are given to you. And then, at best, your thought is likely to be truly something like the internal conflict between ideas that were generated by someone great in the past. So if you're thinking about a serious topic seriously, the probability that you're only thinking about it with your ideas is 0. And so you're more like the battleground of, you're the proximal battleground of great ideas. And they make themselves, the result of that battle makes itself manifest within you. And you might say, well, how does that occur? Well, what do you think about if you're really thinking? Usually, you're trying to solve a problem. So the first precondition for thinking is something like, well, you have a problem. Why think if you don't have a problem? You saw the little ad that was generated for this new essay app that my son and I have developed. One of the things we tried to communicate to people who are writing is that if you're not trying to address something serious when you're writing, which means something that grips you or something that's a problem to you, something you want to solve, then the whole enterprise is just a lie right from the beginning. You're not going to write anything worth writing unless you're writing about something that matters to you, right? And something that matters to you, if you're writing about it, you're thinking it through, it has to be a problem that's got you in its grip. It has to be your problem. And maybe the more seriously you take that, the more likely it is that your thinking and therefore your writing is going to manifest itself in a manner that's of quality to you and to whoever you're communicating with. So, in order for thought to make itself manifest within you, you have to have a problem. You have to admit to the problem, which is a form of humility. I have a problem, and I don't have the solution. That's another form of humility. It's the absence of pride, because if you already knew the answer, you wouldn't have the problem. So you have to admit to the problem, then you have to admit that you don't know. And then you have to want to know. That's the next thing. And that seems to be something like knocking in the hope the door will open. It's like, this is really bothering me. I'd really like to solve this. I'll do anything to solve this. I'll make any sacrifice necessary to solve this. That's another way of thinking about it. And so you open yourself up in that manner to a revelation. That's what it looks like to me. You have a problem, you want an answer, you open yourself up to the possibility of an answer, and you get an answer. Now, you can say you thought that up, but like I said, that's not a very deep theory. It's more like a solution to the problem makes itself manifest in the sphere of your imagination. It's a realization. It's a revelation. It's an insight. It's an intuition. And how that happens is very mysterious. But I do think, and I've thought about what I've had to do to think through serious problems. And I think that's what I just offered you is a pretty decent description of that process. Like, well, first of all, I've got to have a problem. So I have to admit that I have a problem. Then I have to admit I don't know the answer. Then I have to want the answer. Then I have to ask for the answer and allow it to make itself manifest. And then I suppose I have to accept the answer once it appears, and well, then maybe I have to assess the answer as well, right? That would be the critical part of thinking. You get the answer, but then is that a good enough answer? You need to test it. And if you're writing and you edit, that's essentially what you're doing when you're editing. And if you're having a discussion with someone, that's essentially what you're doing when you're discussing, right? Because maybe you're sitting with someone and having a serious discussion with them, and you're trying to solve a problem. Maybe you're doing that with your wife or your husband, and you might say, the first thing you want to agree on is, what the hell's the problem here? And that's often 80% of the discussion. And then, well, having agreed upon the nature of the problem, what do you think? This is what I think. This is what reveals itself to me. And you bloody well pray that your partner is taking the problem seriously and doing everything they can to allow themselves to be open to whatever solution makes itself manifest to them. And you better pray as well that they tell you what that is, because maybe it's a serious problem and you really need a solution, and maybe they're the one that's going to come up with it. And so you hope they're open enough to allow the solution, a solution, to make itself manifest. Maybe you have a different vision of the solution, and so you communicate it with them, and then you go head to head in some sense, assessing the solutions and maybe melding them together and coming up with a meta solution, etc. And that's all part of that process of thought. Imagine who you could be. Okay, so what's the problem? Who could you be? Well, how do you answer? That might be a problem. We could imagine that that would be a problem. Who could I be? Okay, what do you mean imagine? Well, I actually literally mean that. If you could be who you wanted to be, this is a question you can ask yourself. If you could be who you wanted to be, or let's say if you could be who you wanted and needed to be, or maybe you could even extend that, if you could be who you wanted and needed to be in a manner that would be best for you and best for other people, because why not extend it that way? What would that look like? And then you could force yourself to draw a conclusion that you've already drawn, or you could open yourself up and see what you dreamed. You know, when I was a clinician, I actually used to literally do that with people's dreams, because dreams do dream up. Dreams are the birthplace of ideas. That's a good way of thinking about it. That's the imagination, the dream. And if we were struggling, say, in our therapeutic dialogue with issues of identity, it was often very useful to turn to dreams, because dreams would produce visions of possibility. That's what dreams do. That's not all they do, but that's something that they do. And so you could say to yourself, well, this is knocking in a real sense. If I could be who I could be, in the best way that I could be that, what would that look like? That's a great question to ask. It's a frightening question in some sense, because imagine that you develop a vision of yourself that's an improved version of yourself. And you might even say, imagine that you developed a vision of yourself that's a remarkably improved version of yourself. The gap between your present self and that ideal vision is going to produce an internal tension. It's a kind of judgment, right? Because once you formulate an ideal, the ideal judges you. That's a useful thing to know too. No ideal without a judge. And people say, well, you shouldn't be judgmental. It's like, you shouldn't have an ideal? That's the same claim. What are you going to do without an ideal? You're going to not have an ideal? If you don't have an ideal, then what the hell are you going to do? Are you moving towards a less ideal state? Is that the goal for your life, to move towards a less ideal state? Or is the goal of your life to move towards a more ideal state? And I would say that the very idea that it's a goal presumes that what you're doing is moving towards something more ideal. It's built into the notion of goal itself. Imagine who you could be. I have a program online. I designed it with my colleagues at Harvard and at McGill University. One colleague, Dr. Daniel Higgins, who was a student of mine at Harvard, and another colleague, Dr. Robert Peel, who was my graduate supervisor at McGill. We scoured the research literature to see if we could find a scalable, inexpensive, online, mass distributable intervention that would decrease people's anxiety and confusion and disappointment and frustration, the whole coterie of negative emotions, and improve their positive emotion. Those are separate systems, by the way, the negative emotion system and the positive emotion system. And we spent a couple of years looking through the research literature to see if any such intervention existed, and we found converging evidence from a couple of different fields of inquiry that suggested that biographical writing could be of great aid. So here's something to contemplate. If you have memories that are more than 18 months old, and those memories come up of their own accord, and they bother you, they still contain emotion, especially negative emotion, then there are parts of you, this is one way of thinking about it, there are parts of you that are still trapped in the past that are crying to be released. Or there are impediments that you encountered in the past that are still blocking your way. Or there are pits that you fell into because of the error of your ways or because of bad luck that you're still afraid you might run into again. And the reason those memories come up is because the instincts that drive your negative emotions are trying to warn you of danger. And it's the case that if you allow yourself to dream of those memories again, to let them unfold inside you, and if you write about them carefully, that you can find your way once again, and that those memories will recede. It's part of a broader, that fact is part of a broader set of facts that characterize both clinical improvement and learning. Tammy made some reference to that in a narrative way with her story. If you confront that which frightens and stops you voluntarily, you become braver and more able. And that's true with things that might bother you now that you're compelled to avoid, but also true of things in your past that haven't yet been dealt with. And so One of the exercises online, self-authoring exercises, helps you walk through your past, assessing the emotional experiences of your past in the different epochs of your life and trying to get your story straight. Why? So you know where you are. Why? Well, if you don't know where you are, how are you going to plot a course to where you need to be? Because one thing you need to know to get where you want to go is where you are now. Otherwise, you're lost. Another part of this exercises is a future authoring program. And we found a literature mostly produced by industrial psychologists interested in, for example, facilitating or improving performance in the business world, demonstrating, for example, that if you want to motivate your employees, one thing you could do is ask them to detail out their goals as employees. Or you could contrast that with having them develop a vision for their lives. And it turns out that if you encourage those you work with to develop a personal vision, that they become much more effective at work. We formalized that, produced a program, a future authoring program. We used it at a number of universities. The most interesting study I would say we did at a place called Mohawk College, which is a little, like an industrial college, a trade college. Not an Ivy League, not a particularly academic college, but more practical trade college. We had students come in during their summer orientation and write about their future goals, so their ideal future self, let's say, for 90 minutes. No one looked at what they wrote, no one graded it, no one told them how to do it, except the program itself. We compared them to a control group of students, randomly selected, who just wrote for 90 minutes about what they'd done for the last month, to control for writing, right? And we showed that we dropped the dropout rate about 50%, which is a walloping effect for a 90-minute intervention. Interestingly enough, it had a bigger effect for men than for women. Now, the women were doing better, so that might be one of the reasons. But the biggest effect it had was on the men who were doing the worst. So those were the men who had the worst academic performance in high school, and also who had picked an academic pathway at Mohawk College that was the least structured. So it seemed to work best for those men whose motivations were most confused. And you might say, well, of course, all interventions work better for the people who are doing worse, and that's wrong. In fact, it's the opposite of the truth. Most psychological interventions make the people who are doing well do even better. So they have a disproportionate effect at the top end and a relatively lesser effect at the bottom end. This intervention had the reverse effect. So what did it ask people to do? Well, the first part of the program asked people to just sit for 15 minutes and wander through the exercise of imagination that I already presented all of you with. Imagine your life 5 years from now. And I mean this literally. Imagine it, envision it. Allow the simulation to make itself manifest in your imagination. Dream it up. Participate in a fantasy. Allow yourself to participate in a fantasy. An image-dependent fantasy, like a waking dream. Here's the rules. You can have what you need and want in 5 years. But you have to specify it. You have to admit to yourself what it is that you need and want, and you have to have that. You have to allow that to make itself manifest as a compelling reality. And so one of the things you might ask yourself, this is a slight variant on the question, is, over the next 5 years, you're likely to run into some pretty serious obstacles. And those obstacles are going to cause you some misery and grief, and maybe a lot. And if it isn't true in the next 5 years, it's certainly true in the next 10, and it's certain in the next 20. So even if you're fortunate and you escape the inevitable misery of life for 5 years, you're not going to escape it forever. So then you might ask yourself, well, could you develop a vision of yourself that was so compelling that you might conclude that even if you had to bear the misery associated with being you, it would justify that? That's a more specific question, right? What sort of life would you have to have so that you could bear your suffering nobly? That's a good question to ask yourself. Now, and so we have people just write for 15 minutes. If you could have what you wanted and needed, what might that look like? And there's an instruction there too, is do it badly. Because what the hell do you know? And besides, your vision's going to change as you progress through your life. And so you're not going to get it done perfectly, but that's okay. Get it down. Get a rough first draft down, right? A rough approximation of who you could be if you got your act together. Not who other people think you should be, you know? Although that might enter into it because you don't want to be completely... You can't be who you are properly and ignore the fact that you're embedded in a social context. And so you have to take the fact that there are other people into account. And it doesn't mean be who your parents think you should be either, even though that's another source of information that you might want to consider. It's a deeper question. It's like, what would actually motivate you? And you might think, well, I could never have that. It's like, that's not the question that's being addressed here. Although I would say, there's no sense floating off into some kind of impossible juvenile fantasy. And we're making an assumption that you're taking the question seriously and that you're going to remain within the bounds of what you regard as sanely reasonable. So that's the first part. Second part was the opposite of that. It's like, okay, now you've specified a goal. Right? The goal is, in some sense, both your character and your life. And you've specified that rather vaguely. You only had 15 minutes to write about it. And that's a good thing, because now you have something to move toward. Now, I could tell you this technically. This is an interesting thing to know. People say they want to be happy. That's not true, by the way. If you investigate what people mean when they say they want to be happy, they say, I just want to be happy. It's a very funny phrase. It's, what do you mean, just? Like, there isn't anything harder than that. So you can't just say just, that's all you want. You just want to be happy all the time. That's all it would take. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to happen. So you can get rid of the just. And then, I want to be happy. Well, maybe. Actually, what people really mean when they say that is they don't want to suffer and be miserable. So really what they mean is they don't want to experience excess negative emotion. And you can find that out if you carefully question people and carefully analyze the answers. You find out they're actually more concerned about avoiding the catastrophic negative than living in a world of hedonistic delight. Now, you also find that while avoiding the catastrophic tragedy, they wouldn't mind having a little bit of hedonistic delight. And so some happiness is interleaved in there. Then you might ask yourself, to the degree that people do want hedonistic delight when they're being happy, what does happy mean? And you might think, well, happy means getting what you want. Happy is how you feel after Christmas dinner. It's like, no, that's asleep, right? That's content and asleep. Now, that's a form of contentment, but it isn't really what people mean when they say that they want to be happy. The happiness that people refer to when they talk about happiness has more to do with enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is an interesting word because it means it's entheos. It means to be inspired. Inspired is in spirit. It means to be imbued with the Spirit. Well, enthusiastic is to be imbued with the Spirit of God, interestingly enough. And we'll return to that. When do you experience the positive emotion that's associated with happiness? The answer is, not when you've attained a goal, but when you're pursuing one. So you're set up, your positive emotion is associated with movement forward. You could say that your positive emotion is the psychological equivalent of forward movement, just as your negative emotion is the psychological equivalent of freezing or retreating. And so your emotions are very tightly tied to your action. Freeze, retreat, negative. Advance towards a goal, positive. No goal, no positive emotion. Now, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, that's a good thing to remember. No goal, no positive emotion. A corollary of that as well is no goal, confusion. So no goal not only means no positive emotion, it also means confusion, and confusion means anxiety and dread. And so a life without a goal is confusing and hopeless. And that begs a question, what should the goal be? And that's partly what we're trying to establish. You wrote for 15 minutes, you try to develop a vision for your life. Now you have something to move toward. That sets up the precondition for potential positive emotion and happiness. What else do you need to motivate you? Well, how about negative emotion? So what do you do with that? Well, negative emotion can stop you. You might think, well, I'd like to get a better job, but I'm afraid of putting myself out in the job market. I'm afraid of being evaluated. I'm afraid that if I tried something more difficult, I might fail. Then you have your negative emotion opposing you, right? It's anxiety is stopping you. And fair enough, because there are things to be anxious about. But what if you could get your negative emotion behind you, pushing you instead of stopping you? Sometimes in my clinical practice, I would have clients who hated their job. They're laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And maybe that was partly because they'd turned themselves into slaves. But it didn't matter. They were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And they needed to make a move, laterally or up. They needed to make a move. And they were often afraid to. And they had their reasons. They didn't want to contemplate their resumes. They didn't want to open up their CVs. They didn't want to face the inadequacies of their past. They were afraid of being evaluated. They were afraid of being rejected. They didn't know how to negotiate. They didn't know how to conduct themselves in an interview. They were afraid of losing the security they'd already built up. They had their fears, and they were real, and those fears stopped them. But they'd come to me and say, oh my God, you know, I'm so miserable. My life is so miserable, and we'd take that apart. And one of the reasons was because they were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And then we'd talk that through, and they'd say, well, I'm afraid to make a change. And I'd say, well, that's okay. That's understandable. How afraid are you of not making a change? Let's make a little vision of that. You're 35, you hate your job. What's the consequence? You're not motivated. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. You're starting to get depressed. You're getting bitter. You're getting resentful. You're getting cynical. You're amotivated at work. You're not doing a very good job. And you're starting to shrink. Now play that out for 10 years. You don't change it. You don't fix it. And what happens? Well, it's not like it's going to get better of its own accord. What's going to happen to you? Well, for sure, at minimum, what's going to happen to you is you're going to be in the same situation, but 10 years older. And if you can't get out of that situation now, what the hell makes you think you're going to get out of it in 10 years? You're 10 years older, you're 10 years more bitter, you're 10 years more cynical. Maybe by that time your marriage has collapsed because who the hell wants to live with you? You're even more of a slave than you were because you've labored another 10 years under the thumb of the tyrant and stepped backwards every time you were asked to, so you got smaller and smaller as the tyrant got bigger and bigger. It's like think about that, and that means imagine it. Imagine that, okay? Now that's the situation. You're stuck where you are, but it's 10 years from now. And when I say think of that, I mean imagine that. It's like really play it out. It's like, you know how miserable you are now? You're afraid of making the necessary changes, but you know how miserable you are now. Just imagine how miserable you could be in 10 years. And in all likelihood, what you'll find is that you're way more afraid of that than you are of whatever's stopping you in the present. It's really useful to know what your own particular brand of hell might be. And so one of the things we do in this writing exercise is have people do the reverse. It's like, okay, so imagine now, 5 years from now, you've let whatever temptations you're particularly susceptible to have the upper hand. And they've augured you into the ground. You know, one person's an alcoholic, another person's a criminal, another person's living on the street, someone else is like skirting the edges of prostitution, somebody else is narcissistic and bitter, somebody else is depressed and anxious. You know where you would fall off the edge of the earth if you fell off in whatever direction you're prone to fall off. Everyone knows that, but we avoid that. You know, that's rule 3. Do not hide things in the fog. Is that the rule? Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Yeah, well, we often won't allow ourselves to imagine the catastrophe that we're pursuing. Let's say through inaction. That's a good thing to fix. So now you say, well, you think for 15 minutes, that's not very long, about who you could be and what you could have if you could have what you wanted, if you were who you could be. And then you think about what sort of hell you could produce for yourself if you didn't do that. And that's not a bad polarity. It's like, I'm going to get away from that and I'm going to move towards that. And then you have your negative emotion working for you and your positive emotion working for you. And that's a good gradient, and that's a great gradient emotionally because, as I said, you don't experience positive emotion except in relationship to a goal. And if you got a nice gradient on your goal pursuit, then that's going to increase the degree to which you feel positive emotion. And positive emotion, by the way, isn't just about being happy. That's the most trivial part of it in some sense. Positive emotion allows you to focus. It's the soul of concentration. It's the essence of enthusiastic motivation. When you say, I really want to do that, that statement is predicated on the existence of positive emotion. It's the fact that the goal beckons to you that makes you say, I want to do that. And you know how much easier it is to do something you want to do than to do something you don't want to do. And that ease is actually a consequence of the activation of the system that governs positive emotion. And you might ask yourself, well, how powerful a system is that? And I would say, well, almost all of the drugs of abuse that people are most prone to abusing are abused because they activate the positive emotion system. So cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin is also a painkiller, but it has a psychomotor stimulant element. That's the technical term for the pharmacological effect of pharmacological agents on the positive emotion system. Psychomotor stimulation, psychomotor because it's associated with movement forward. And cocaine is such a powerful drug because it makes you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. That's the system it hyperactivates. And so it's a primary system of motivation. It's as old as forward movement itself. It's a cardinal source of meaning. And it only manifests itself in relationship to a goal. Now, you might say, well, I don't know what I want or need 5 years from now. It's too complex a question. It's too much for me to consider. And I would say, fair enough. It's sort of like the question of, well, what's the meaning of life? You know, someone might ask you that. They can collapse a lot of mystery into a single, what's the meaning of life? And you probably can't really come up with it. And so they say, well, that just shows there's no meaning to life. It's like, well, no, you formulated the question badly and you put me on the spot. And what do you want a one-sentence answer or something for the meaning of life just because you can phrase it in a question? It's like, it's too much. And so I had clients, students as well, people in my life who were perplexed by that question. I helped them take it apart. What's the meaning of life? Let's take that apart. What are some of the meanings of life? And then we can take that apart. Where do people typically find meaning in their life? And now we're getting somewhere. That's a more answerable question. And so here are some places. You can think this through for yourself and see if it's in accordance with your own experience. I'm not saying everyone gets meaning from all of these endeavors, and I'm not saying that to find meaning, you have to involve yourself in all of these endeavors. I'm saying that if you don't know where to find meaning, you might as well look at the common experience of meaning, derive whatever conclusions you can from that, follow that pattern, unless you have a better idea. So, I used to do this when I was assessing people for depression, because one of the things I was very curious about with my depressed clients was, are you depressed, or do you just have an awful life? And people always laugh at that formulation. I don't know why exactly. You laugh because you think, well, that's kind of a nasty way of putting it, but also because you think, well, yeah, that's actually a good question. Depressed people usually have a pretty good life. If they're truly depressed, they have a pretty good life, but they can't see it, right? They become blind to it. And then you might say, well, how do you know if someone has a pretty good life? Well, that bears on the question we're trying to address. Do you have an intimate partner? So the answer might be yes or no, but generally people, if they don't have an intimate partner, they would like one. And so that's one potential source of meaning. Do you have intact and functional familial relationships of some sort? With your parents, with your siblings, with your children, with your extended family? Do you have a family? And is the family functional, at least to some degree? Could be yes or no again. But generally for people, to have a functional family is better than not, and certainly much better than having a dysfunctional family. And so if you don't have an intimate relationship and you don't have a family, well, the probability that you're lonely is pretty damn high. Not only lonely, but also, in some sense, dangerously insecure and adrift, because you also don't have anybody close to rely on, or that can rely on you in times of trouble. And so those are domains of the absence of salutary meaning, let's say. Are you about as educated as you are intelligent? And that's useful to know too, because if you have an ability, it might perhaps be better for you if you have made as much of it as you can. And so that's another question you can ask yourself. Do you have a job or a career? Now, a job keeps body and soul together, let's say, and a career adds compelling intrinsic interest to what might otherwise only be a job. But I would say, all things considered, it's a lot better to have a job. It might be better to have a career than a job, but it's better to have a job than not to have a job. And the data on that are very clear. Lots of men in particular are tipped into depression when they lose their job. And that's true even if they didn't particularly like their job. And it's because, well, I think in some real sense, it's because people are pack animals, like sled dogs, and we need to be pulling against the traces. And if you can set that up for yourself, so that you're your own master, so much the better. But if you can't, then it's still better to be in harness properly. And perhaps that shouldn't be your whole life, and probably it shouldn't. But if you don't have that, well, then that's something else you don't have. Are you engaged civically in any manner? No. Do you attend church? Are you part of a political club? Are you part of a sports club? Are you part of a local businessman club? Is there some social organization that's rather formal that you're aligned with in some manner? Do you take care of yourself mentally and physically? That might be an exercise routine, etc. Are you capable of regulating life's more significant temptations? So another thing you see with people when you're trying to assess the quality of their life is your use of substances, it's usually alcohol, has that spiraled out of control enough so that it's interfering with your progress forward in ways that you know and that other people also can see? And so there's 7 domains. You could imagine that if someone had none of that, I missed one. Are you engaged in any creative endeavor? Now, not everyone's creative. In fact, the vast majority of people aren't creative. But if you are creative, then that's another place that you can derive meaning. And even people who aren't particularly creative often have something they do that's somewhat creative. That's another place you can draw meaning from. So let's say you have none of those, and you come to me, and I find out you have none of those, and you say you're depressed, and I would say, no, you're not depressed. You have a terrible life. And so then the goal there would be to help people build subroutines in each of those domains so that they could start to make progress, say, on all 7 fronts, and perhaps not simultaneously, perhaps one at a time. But the diagnosis would be, well, it's no wonder you're miserable. You're not going anywhere, and so there's no positive emotion. And you're not anywhere, so you're lost and confused. So of course you're miserable. You're not depressed. Your life is not well constituted. And I think that's all in accord with what we might regard as common sense. And you might object, well, I don't need all those things to be happy. It's like, yeah, fair enough. You can tell me that if you don't have any of those things and you're happy, but someone like that is extraordinarily rare. And you could also object, well, I don't need all those things to be happy. It's like, that could be. And you might be the sort of person who doesn't need any of those things except to be hyper creative. Because there's the odd person like that, but it's pretty damn unlikely. And unless you are a singular person in some sense, it's reasonable for you, if your life is aimless and you're nihilistic, to attempt to draw meaning from the sources of meaning that everyone else draws from. It's a good place to start. And as I said, if you're special enough to break those rules and still thrive, hey, more power to you. But it's highly improbable, although possible. It's highly improbable, and it's a very, 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 very difficult to sustain. Okay, so back to the rule and the phrasing. Imagine who you could be. So we said, well, imagine what you need and want 5 years from now. Imagine what you don't need or want. Differentiate that so you have something approximating a differentiated vision. Now you've got an imaginative representation of who you could be. So you might say on the intimate partner front, it just shows you how daft we are, because we never do this with teenagers, not even once. We never get them to sit down and think, okay, you're a 14-year-old girl, you're a 15-year-old girl. What do you want in a partner? You're not a 15-year-old girl, by the way, in case you were wondering. Because apparently people are wondering about such things now. What are you looking for in a partner if you could have what you wanted? Well, I don't really know, or I'll know it when I see it. It's like, no, probably not. No, you'll just stumble into it, and that won't work out very well. When my wife and I moved to Boston, we moved from Montreal, Canada, into Boston, the United States. And American cities are a lot different than Canadian cities. They have it's a different culture, and there are different rules. And we didn't really know anyone in Boston, and Boston's a big city, and so we wanted to buy a house, but we had no idea where to live. And Boston, Massachusetts, is basically an extended city, and there's a lot of people there, so there's a lot of territory. So we had no idea where to look. We looked at about 150 houses, because we had to get to know the city. And before we did that, we sat and wrote down what we wanted in a house. We sat down jointly and thought, well, if we could have the house we wanted, what would it look like? And then we sort of rank ordered the criteria. And then after we'd looked at about 120 houses or so, we found this house that we kind of liked, and we thought, well, should we put an offer in this house? And we thought, well, let's look at our list, and it checked all the boxes. We thought, well, it appears to be the house we wanted, and we could identify it, because we had set the criteria for it. That's kind of cool too, because what that implies, and I think it's true, is that if you don't know what you want, how will you know when you get it? And if you don't know what you want, how will you be happy when you get it? Because you won't even know you got it. And so, you might want to think about what you want. You might want to think about what you want with regard to a relationship. And people we just don't do that. And it's so peculiar. It's so odd. You know, when I developed this program, one of the things that really came to haunt me in the aftermath of developing it was the realization, because I used to get my students to do it in this class I taught called Maps of Meaning. Some of you may have watched some of those lectures online. I had the students write out their past. They do the past authoring exercise, biography, and I had them write a future authoring exercise, like who the hell are you? Where do you come from? Where are you now? And what do you want? And it was so painful. These students were in the 3rd year of university, so they'd been educated for 15 years, and no one had ever sat them down, not once in their entire education, and said, okay, you can have what you want or need, but you have to figure out what it is. What is it? And you know, a little coaching along the way wouldn't be such a bad thing. You know, you might want to, you'd think, if you're teaching teenagers, let's say, and they're starting to develop a bit of a vision for the future, you might find out what that vision consists of and what they've contemplated, and if their vision was practically realizable, and to push them on it a little bit just to see if they'd, you know, grappled with it. The fact that we don't do this it's so amazing. I found out why, actually, because I delved into that. This is kind of interesting too. So it turns out that the public school system was, this is its derivation via the United States, it was predicated on the Prussian military model. So at the turn of the 19th century, rural people were flooding into the cities, right, to take up work in factories. And there were 2 problems. One is, well, what do you do with the kids when the parents are working in the factory? And the other was, well, how do you train people who were once rural to work in factories? And the answer is, well, we don't know, but the Prussians know how to make soldiers, obedient soldiers of the state, and we can probably translate that model into our education system, and we can make ideal workers. And the people who did that were fascists. Like, really? This is way before World War II. This was before fascism had the same connotation it does now, but it's still worth thinking about. It's like, well, why don't we encourage our children to be autonomous visionaries? And the answer is, well, because we derived our education system from the Prussian military model, and it was designed to make young men into obedient cannon fodder for emperors. So that doesn't seem like a very good model to me, especially not anymore, but there you go. And we haven't seemed to notice this for like 150 years, and so we don't do this, even though it works. Even though you can produce a revolutionary transformation in someone's life by having them do this for 90 minutes. Painful. And so then you ask this, I mentioned this biblical reference, you know, knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. You think, there's no way that's true. It's like, what if you tried doing that for like 200 hours or 2,000 hours instead of 90 minutes? What if you devoted yourself to that? What would open up to you? And I would say what would open up to you would be beyond your wildest imaginings. So, and that's definitely worth thinking about. In fact, it's more worth thinking about than anything else. Imagine who you could be. We've covered that. And then aim like a target, right? Specify the target. What are the preconditions for hitting a target? There has to be a target. You have to take aim. You have to focus on the center. You have to draw back the bowstring, and you have to let the arrow go. The word sin derives from the Greek word hamartia. There's a Jewish word, Hebrew word, I think it's chet, which is also an archery term. Both hamartia and chet mean the same thing. They mean to miss the target. Sin is an archery term. It means to miss the target, which is very cool. It's a very cool idea. It puts a whole new spin on that whole concept. It's like, how do you miss the target? Well, don't look at the target. That's a good start. Don't aim. Don't draw your bow back, your bowstring back. Those are all ways of missing. You're certainly not going to hit the target if you don't specify the target, and you're not going to hit a specified target unless you aim at it. So aim, and then aim single-mindedly. So there's this concept called self-similarity. I can give you an example of that. A coast is self-similar. So imagine the outline of a coast on a map. You might say, well, is that the shape of the coast? It's like, well, it's roughly the shape of the coast, but if you actually walk down to the coast, the actual coast, you'll see that the water moves in and out rather irregularly, and it's almost impossible to specify exactly where the line is. And you could get right down to the level of the sand grains, and there'd be coast there, right, in the same shape as the larger coast. And then you could go even to the surface of the sand grain itself, and you'd see it was all rough like the coast. And you can just keep doing that all the way down the levels of resolution, right to the subatomic level. It's self-similar. The pattern is replicated at every level. And the world has elements of self-similarity. And so this rule says, aim single-mindedly at one thing and see what happens. You might say, well, which thing? And the answer is, it probably doesn't really matter. So imagine that you decided that you'd be a better you if your friendships were more robust. And so then you might start taking that apart conceptually. And you do this as a behavioral therapist. If you came to see me, I might say, well, do you have any friends? And you might say, yeah, one or two. I might say, well, how often do you see them? Well, I don't actually see them. Well, how often do you communicate with them? Well, I talked to my best friend on the phone for 5 minutes 3 months ago. It's like, okay, that's not so good. That's not so good. So let's see if we could come up with something approximating a more functional ideal of friendship. So 0 friends is the wrong number. So let's say 1 or 2 or 3. It's like, how often are you going to see them? Well, once or twice a week. What are you going to do with them? Well, dinner, movie, bowling, hobby. You know, there's various things you can do with your friends. You might want to think about what you want to do with them. You might want to think about how you want to treat them for them to be friends. Now, friendship is a form of reciprocal exchange. It's a form of offered and returned favors. That's another way of thinking about it. It's a form of recurrent game. So when children start to make friends, when 2 children are investigating each other to see if they're compatible, maybe they'll play a game together. Imagine a boy and a girl encountering each other for the first time, 3 or 4 years old. The boy and the girl are in the same place, and maybe they're kind of inclined to play, like a dog in a park might be inclined to play. Same circuitry, by the way, in the dog, which is why we can play with dogs. We can tell when they want to play. The boy and the girl are motivated, sort of a priori, to play, and then they check each other out. And for a boy and a girl to play properly, they have to be at about the same level of development. So for them to be friends. And so maybe the boy invites the girl to play house, and the girl says yes, and the boy says, well, I'll be the daddy and you be the mommy, and then they lay out their roles, and then they simulate the game, and they're practicing the development of a reciprocal relationship, and that's the grip of the game. And then if that's fun, which is interesting, if it's fun, if they dance together well, if they can play off each other well, if they can enter into a joint simulation in a manner that's mutually engaging, then they'll want to repeat the experience. And the sequence of repeating those experiences is a friendship. And so that's cool, and that's good to know if you have friends, because friendship is an iterating game. It's a good thing to know about your partner, your wife or your husband, to the degree that you can be friends with them, is that if your relationship is optimized, it's an iterating game. And a game is, it's the pursuit of a shared goal, governed by a shared set of principles, that you both engage in voluntarily, that's spontaneously engaging. And so you can tell if your relationship is working because it's a sequence of those interactions. And you're going to deviate from that, and partly because life is difficult and it can't always be a game. But you might hope that even when it's rough going, there's still some game in it, a bit of a sense of humor maybe, a bit of a sense of play, and that is a sign of mastery. And so you develop some friendships, let's say that's your goal, and you learn to play a bit, and well, then you have some friends, and that's a plus, but that isn't all, because while you're developing that capacity for friendship, you're developing skills that are going to be useful for the pursuit of all sorts of other goals. So, for example, if you learn to be a good friend, this is why it's so terrible for children not to have friends. There's almost nothing worse that can happen to a child who's 4 or older than to not have friends. It's a complete bloody catastrophe, and there's almost nothing that can be done about it, by the way. So, part of your goal as a parent, for those of you who have young children, you should know this. Your goal as a parent is to maximize your child's value as a play partner by the age of 4. Because if you do that, then they'll be popular. You think, well, life isn't all about popularity. It's like, yeah, try unpopularity. See where that gets you. And of course, it's not all about popularity. But it's a pretty damn wretched child who has no friends. Especially if they have no friends and a lot of other children who don't like them. That's a little hell for your child, and once they're in that hell, it's very hard for them to get out. So, you develop some friendships, you learn to play, and then you're a better player, and then what? Well, then you're probably going to be a better partner for someone in an intimate relationship. That'd be helpful. And you're probably going to be better in your job. A lot of you guys out there, and women too, who've had laboring jobs, rather harsh jobs, you know perfectly well that one of the things that makes those jobs not only tolerable, but often engaging and meaningful is that the guys you're working with play. They got a vicious sense of humor, There's a camaraderie around the difficult work, and that camaraderie, the spirit of camaraderie, and joint support is enough to make the difficult job, not just bearable, but optimally challenging and worthwhile. And you're very fortunate if you have a group of compatriots working at a difficult job with you, have that spirit. That's one of the things that makes military life, can make military life, for example, a high calling, or difficult labor for that matter, or any brutal working class job. That sense of play and that sense of humor that goes along with it, often gallows humor, especially in very difficult jobs. And so you concentrate on developing friends. It's like you get better in all sorts of different ways, and you can take that better into different domains, and then you start to be better in multiple areas simultaneously. And what's quite interesting about that is that, if you're wondering where to start as you move towards who you could be in a better sense, I could say, well, start somewhere. Pick something. It doesn't matter. It's like, well, it should be, implement the best plan you've got. And you might say, well, I don't know if that's the right plan. It's like, yeah, no one knows if it's the right plan. It's like, put some effort into it, aim at it, pursue it diligently, become expert at it. The probability that developed expertise will have cross-situational utility is unbelievably high. So that's cool, because it probably means something like, doesn't really matter which game you're playing as long as you become good at it. But it really matters that you become good at least one game. And that's sort of like a meta game, right? Or a meta rule. The meta rule is, on the relativistic side, there's lots of games. But the higher order rule is, yeah, but you have to get good at least one of them. And then a rule above that is, if it's a game and you get good at it, the skills you've developed will be useful in other games. And I think that's all technically true. And so that's an optimistic idea too. Because I often had clients or students who'd say to me, well, you know, I don't really know what to do with my life. It's like, well, let's not talk about your whole damn life, because that's just too much. We could break it down in the way that I described. We could concentrate on more proximal goals, let's say. But I could also say, well, do you have an inkling of where you might head? It's like, yeah. It's like, well, head there. You know, with a loose touch in some sense, because you might say, well, maybe you're 18 and you're trying to figure out what your major is in university, and you don't really know. It's like, that's okay, pick one, go pursue it hard for a year. And then you can reevaluate at the end of the year. Probably you're a lot smarter by the end of that year. And even if you were going in the wrong direction, like if that direction isn't in accord with the demand of your spirit, at least you've fleshed yourself out now. You've gathered a bunch more information. You're more disciplined. You have more skill. And the probability that you'll now be able to orient yourself in a direction that's slightly more appropriate for you is very, very high. And so it's much better to move forward with discipline towards a specified goal, even if you might be wrong, than it is to spin in place indefinitely. And so that's kind of useful too, because it means you can be stupid and ignorant about what you want, right? Only vaguely conscious of the demand of your own spirit, but you can experiment badly and stupidly and still move forward. And I would say that's not a bad definition of life, right? Experimenting badly and stupidly and still moving forward. And perhaps as you experiment badly and stupidly, you get less bad and less stupid and more able to specify the proper aim. And you do that by starting somewhere. And that's in some real sense the utility of discipline. And that's a meta rule, that discipline is useful. What direction? Doesn't matter so much. Pick a damn direction. Move towards it. That'll give you some enthusiasm. It'll quell your anxiety. It'll help unite you. It'll help develop skill. It'll inform you. It'll increase your capacity for vision. It'll make your ability to dream up a better future. It'll increase your ability to dream up a better future. It'll put you on the right track. That all works. And so what's the rule? Imagine who you could be. Okay, that's a literal request. Maybe you could be who you could be. And then aim. Single-mindedly. Right? So there's a sacrifice there too, because while you're aiming single-mindedly at that, there's a lot of other things you aren't doing. That's an opportunity cost. And you might say, is it worth it? It's like, well, you'll inform yourself, you'll develop discipline, you'll develop the requisite skill, you'll become a better visionary, you'll be able to integrate yourself better because you're integrating yourself in relationship to a goal, and so now you're more integrated. That means you're more in control of yourself. You have a better sense of who you are. That all seems to be a good thing. And you run that out continually, and you put yourself together. And so, if you imagine who you can be, and you aim single-mindedly at that, the probability that you'll become who you could be, there's a high probability that you can become who you could be. And I'll close with this, and then we'll move to a Q&A. I've wondered this for a long time, and you could ask yourself this too. Life is bitter and brutal, and there's no shortage of tragedy. And We all ask ourselves, is it worth it? We might ask ourselves that in some fundamental sense. Many people are crippled by a depressive episode at some point in their life that's so severe that they contemplate suicide. And so even if you haven't been brought to that extreme, it's a rare person who hasn't hovered on the edge of that from time to time. And even existentially, life is a veil of suffering. And there's some fundamental truth in that. And you can see why you could derive justification for hopelessness, confusion, and nihilism from that conclusion. But then you could ask yourself this question: have you taken advantage of every opportunity that presented itself to you? So you imagine that to set against that dreadful actuality, there's a domain of possibility that presents itself to you as opportunity, as the call to adventure, and that you can pursue that with all your might and gather the consequent rewards and set them against the tragedy of life. And then you could ask yourself, if you did that fully, would your life stop being tragic? Or you could produce a variant of that question and say, even if your life didn't stop being tragic, if you pursued every possibility that made itself manifest to you, would your life become such a great adventure that the tragedy would justify itself? And that's definitely a question not only worth asking, but a question worth acting out. Because it could be the case that in some fundamental sense, the unbearable part of your suffering is proportional to your unwillingness to make use of the possibility that presents itself to you. And it's a pessimistic realization in some sense, right? Because it puts the burden on you. But it's an optimistic proposition in another sense, because it opens up a very interesting landscape of possibility. Maybe there is enough beckoning in front of you to turn the catastrophe of your life into the great adventure of your life. And maybe whether or not that possibility is allowed to manifest itself is dependent on your willingness to open yourself up and engage with that which beckons to you. In the story of Exodus, there's a scene where Moses leads people out of... Moses is the bane of tyrants and the savior of slaves. He's an archetypal figure psychologically and socially. He's in the desert one day and he sees something that glimmers to the side. And he goes to investigate. It's clear from the text that he could walk by. And when he goes to investigate, he sees that it's a bush and it's burning with a flame that doesn't consume it. And so it's something that spontaneously attracts his attention. It grips him. And he turns to look and to investigate, and he finds out that it's the Spirit of God himself that's manifesting itself to him in the guise of this thing that's caught his attention. And it's at that point where Moses asks God what his name is, and God essentially says something like, I'm the Spirit of being itself. I am what I am that I am, I will be what I will be, I am what I always have been. It's all that. It's the Spirit of being. That possibility that makes itself manifest to you. That's the Spirit of being itself calling to you. There's a hypothesis. One hypothesis is that there's enough plenitude in that Spirit of being to deliver to you what you need and want if you knock and you ask and you seek. And all of that's hidden behind rule 2. Imagine who you could be, and then aim single-mindedly at that. Thank you very much. I'll be right back.
Well, looks like you guys are all still awake, so that's good. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure that was an interesting conversation. I wasn't listening, I was backstage, but I've been here probably 200 times, so I have a little bit of an idea of what it was like. He hasn't given a lecture for quite a few months. We've been doing Q&As for 90 minutes, answering questions from the crowd, but tonight he wanted to go back to the book, so I hope that was enlightening for you. We're going to sit here now and we're going to do about 20 minutes of questions and answers that you have put on Slido. I was thinking, just sitting down there, and a thought came to my mind, and I thought, okay, I'll share it with you. Now and then, Jordan and I have done magic mushrooms. Yeah. You know, back when we were in university, and then, like, even recently, so it was only about a couple of years ago. And my kids are grown, and I always take a moderate amount of mushrooms. I'm not an extremist in that regard, but I'm not scared of it either, so I take enough that I have my imagination is in the forefront. Anyway, I imagined a cathedral that was on top of me, and it was lit on both sides, and one was my daughter and the other was my son, and they formed a cathedral on top of me. And I thought, isn't that an interesting vision? And I just wanted to share that with you, because before, at the very beginning, when we outlined the essay app that my son has worked hard on working up and bringing to the public, and my daughter's Peterson Academy that she's starting to bring professors and offering courses to everyone. I'm very proud of them, and I realize that they are my future, they are our future, and I'm very grateful. And with that, I'll bring Dr. Peterson back on stage.
Well, I didn't know where you were going with that story. But you pulled it together pretty well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you listen and just see what comes up, right? Yeah. Okay, well, I didn't hear what you talked about, so I put down some questions.
Okay.
And you can do whatever you want with them.
All right.
All right. Dear Dr. Peterson, do you believe that mankind truly has free will? Or are our actions / thoughts all predetermined? If the latter, how do we find meaning in this?
It's not a matter of belief. The future is unpredictable, technically speaking. The universe is not deterministic, technically speaking. There isn't any dispute about that. You're not a clockwork machine. And the reason that we know that is because a clockwork machine can't compute the transforming horizon of the future. So, now whether or not that means we have free will, that's a different issue, because it's not exactly obvious what free will means, and it's obvious as well that to some degree our will is bounded. But it certainly does mean that whatever you are, you're not a deterministic clockwork machine. And whatever the universe is, it's not a deterministic clockwork machine. So, now, I said that's bounded. I can show you an action that's deterministic. So, this is called a ballistic movement. So, I'll do this. Okay, so it's a very rapid movement, and it's a complex movement because I accelerated my hand very rapidly and I stopped it just before it hit this surface. And the amount of time it took for my hand to move from here to here is shorter than the amount of time it took for the message from my hand to get to my brain and back if I want to adjust the movement once it's released. And so to make a ballistic movement, I have to set up the action and in a deterministic manner and then disinhibit it and let it run. And when it runs, I can't control it. That's why it's called a ballistic movement. A ballistic missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, is ballistic like a bullet because once you shoot it, you can't control what it does. And so it does look like as we implement our actions, the horizon of possibility collapses into a deterministic actuality. But the farther out into the future we look, the less determined our perceptions and actions necessarily become. So, and we don't, well, I'll leave it at that. So I can give you a contrary vision that's associated with what I talked about tonight. You're not a clockwork machine. What are you? You're a visionary. So, and to understand that, you have to reconfigure how you think about the world, because most of you undoubtedly think like scientific materialists, at least in part. You're probably not very good at thinking like scientific materialists, but because very few people think scientifically in a very thorough manner, but still the basic architecture of your thought is going to be of that not nature. And so you think there are objects in the world, and you think that you react to the objects and in a deterministic way, and none of that's true. You don't see objects that are objective. You see patterns that are functional, and they don't determine your action because you're not a clockwork machine driven by stimulus. All of that's wrong. Imagine what you confront when you wake up in the morning. You might say, well, I wake up in my bedroom and I confront the furniture. It's like, that's sort of like thinking that, imagine you're at a theater and you're watching a play and the stage is set with the props. And the actors come on and they say their lines and you say, the props caused that. Like, none of that's even vaguely true. And you know, the props in a play aren't objects either. They're facilitators of the symbolic message of the play. And I think you can say that about the objects in the actual world. They're not objects, they're facilitators of the symbolic meaning of the play. And then what do you confront when you wake up in the morning? Well, it's not the damn furniture in your room. It's the possibility of the day. You know, the possibility of the day makes itself manifest to you, and it presents itself as a problem. How will I interact with what's transforming in front of me in a manner that will bring about the desired end? And you might be very bad at that, which just means you're impulsive, and after the realization of very short-term visions, and so you're more hedonistic and immature in your visionary orientation, or you're sophisticated and you integrate the possibility that makes itself manifest to you with a higher order and sophisticated vision. And then you grapple or wrestle with that emergent possibility to realize it. And by doing that, you participate in the creation of the world. And the fact that you're of that kind is the reason, for example, that our culture is predicated on the idea that you're made in the image of God. Because God is the spirit that confronts chaos and possibility and transforms it into habitable reality. And that's you, in the microcosm. And that's a divine thing that you're participating in. And you can tell that because if you do it right, it's deeply meaningful. And you can tell that because if you do it right and it's deeply meaningful, the habitable order that you generate from the encounter with chaos and potential is good. And so the word that manifests itself at the beginning of time, the creative word, confronts potential, the tohu vabohu, the wasteland, the water, the deep, all of that, symbolic representation of potential, uses truth and love to shape that potential and produces the order that is good. And that's why it says in Genesis, it's repeated over and over after each day of creation. And God saw what he had created, and it was good. And so if you're oriented properly in your life, when you contend with the transforming horizon of the future, which is the entrance of becoming into being, that's another way of thinking about it, then you contend with that as a high-order ethical actor, and you transform that potential into the habitable order that is good. And that's the sine qua non of ethical action. And we all recognize it as such. So that's the answer to that question.
If the foundation of society is family, where do you see the breakdown of family happening? And what can we do as individuals to help build society back?
I think a big part of the breakdown in the family is our idiot concept of our idiotically one-sided conception of right and freedom. It's something like that. And the reason I say that is because, well, let's say, why would you be disinclined to engage in the process of building a stable family? And one answer might be, well, you're just utterly useless, right? You can barely take care of yourself, much less someone else. But let's leave that aside for a moment, although that might be a contributing problem. That's just sheer inability. Another problem would be, well, it's kind of an immature hedonism in some sense. Why would I want the burden of a family? Why would I want the constraints of a permanent relationship when I can have all the freedom to choose? It's like, well, first of all, why do you think that a family is a burden? And second, why do you think that all that choice, which I doubt you have anyways, is freedom? Well, like many people say, well, you know, I don't want to limit myself to one partner. It's like, no, you don't want to limit yourself to one partner, but pretty much everyone else wants to limit you to maybe even less than one partner. So it's a deep immaturity and ignorance that's gripped us because we don't understand. Here's something we don't understand. We don't understand. It's a three-part set of propositions, thesis. You need a meaning to sustain you in the face of suffering, or you become bitter and nihilistic and malevolent and hopeless. The meaning that will sustain you through suffering is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. Now, every time I've said that, and it happened again tonight, every single person goes silent. Why? It's because no one said that for 60 years. And everyone knows it. You think, well, and I can be very concrete about this. My wife and I both were very ill over the last 3 years. My daughter was also very ill. And ill in a very brutal way. And ill in a brutal way that unfolded over months and years. And we've had ample opportunity to reflect on what made that bearable to the degree that it was bearable. And the answer is pretty clear. What made it bearable? The love we had for our children, the love we had for each other, the love we had for our friends, and mutually so, the love that was reflected back to us by the broader community. When Tammy was in the hospital, she was in the hospital extensively in 2019. And there were people sending prayers, essentially, from all over the world. My sister would print them out. in the morning and put them on the hospital room. Hotel. There was no hotel. Hospital room. And all of that, and my family, not just my kids, my wife, my friends, my parents, my siblings, all pulled together in a remarkable way. And well, I'll tell you a story, or you can tell the story if you want.
Go ahead.
You want me to tell the story?
You're
Okay. Well, Tammy was diagnosed with a very slow-growing form of cancer in 2018, and we were assured that it was nothing to worry about. And then she had surgery for the cancer, and then when we came back a month later, she had some pain in her side near the surgical site, and we were informed within the span of about 10 minutes that she had been misdiagnosed and that the cancer she had was not only fatal, but 100% fatal, extremely rare, 100% fatal within 11 months. And so that was rather shocking, as you might imagine. And so Tammy reacted to that with her customary bravery and grace, and in some sense accepted it. And as she told me, many of her relatives had died in their late 50s, and she had learned to accept that as part of the potential natural course of events. But then she went and told our son, and he wasn't nearly as sanguine about it as she was. And she realized that the significance of her life wasn't precisely to be measured by its significance to her, that it had its own intrinsic significance, and that it was possible that her son saw that even more clearly than she did. And I would say, being an observer of both of them, that part of the reason that experience made itself manifest is because Tammy really loves her son and was a very good mother to him. And in all possible regards, I would say, and that was reflected back to her, that responsibility that she had taken was reflected back to her in that moment. And that was, I would say, a cardinal part of her decision to do whatever was necessary to survive. Now, why she survived is a complicated issue, and we don't know, except that she did. But that's just a small story about where the meaning that sustains you come from. You know, if you're in pain, if you're suffering, if you're deteriorating, if you're desperate, you're fortunate if you have a web of relationships that you've cultivated to buoy you up. That's what you have in a marriage if you make the right sacrifices, and you're fortunate. So I would say, well, why take responsibility? Well, because that's where you find meaning. You find the meaning there that will sustain you through the catastrophe of your life. And the more you bear that responsibility, the more meaning will be there when you need it. And then I would say, too, there's an idea that's deeply embedded in our culture, it's an extraordinarily deep idea, that it's incumbent upon all of us to voluntarily bear our crosses as we stumble uphill. And that's a celebration of the heaviest possible responsibility, right? To take on yourself the literal burden of betrayal, death, pain, torment, tyranny, atrocity, all of that. To take that on voluntarily, to lift it onto your shoulders, and to walk uphill. And perversely and paradoxically, it's in the willingness to adopt that responsibility that you find the meaning that allows you to bear precisely that load. And that's the answer to that question.
So we've only got a few minutes left.
I'll be quick. Probably not.
Okay.
Okay.
What is a woman?
Oh! I figured out the answer to that today. If it has a prostate, it's not a woman. All right. Very funny, by the way. Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all, and appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you, dear. Good to see you all. Thank you. Thank you.